And welcome everybody to the sixth episode of Ed the Pagan Show as we continue forward of doing at least 365 this year of these shows. And right now is open. And today I'm going to have a question. We're talking about trauma. I have said it many times in the past that I think the pagan is a trauma eating and converting machine. A lot of their energy and a lot of their profits, as people would call it. Yes, I talk in profits because that seems to be the language of the day. Um, but the successes we have in our community are how we recover our people, how people get better, how people begin living a healthier, happier life. Um, I mean, one of the biggest things I know people having a healthier, happier life is the people who do canning. I've seen a lot of people go from just buying canned foods and sort of the processed foods to doing their own foods, and they feel better about that. I'm not saying that's an answer or not an answer because that's a decision you have to make for yourself. But I do see it in people and see them being happier. That's my real goal in our pagan world is to have a high enough quality of life that we're happy. That's simple. And well, Shane Nelson here had answered one of my Facebook questions, and I mentioned that this idea that our community is deeply involved with trauma, and that is one of its biggest goals, obstacles. I mean, goals, yeah, to clear that out of our way, to make us more active in the world, to make us more useful to the world. Yes, that's one of our goals, right? To make people more compassionate, more loving, more caring. And then the other side of it is that we get that shut off a lot. We don't know that that's valuable to people. We don't know that that's right. And so we are, as a community, still dealing with the idea of trauma. Do you have trauma? Do we have trauma? And where it sits in it. So Shaden talked about his own study that he did, and part of his thesis study. And I think Byron Ballard answered him and asked, where'd you get this information from? And then he told us, and this was amazing. So here I am bringing you our interview with Shane Nelson about trauma, not from the point of view of how to cure it, how to do it, but how it's affecting our community, the real statistical numbers. So the leaders, listen up. This is a great piece for you. And remember, we are sponsored by CorellianPublishing.com.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Ed the Pagan Show. In our interviews today, I'm doing Shane Nelson. Shane Nelson has done something that was pretty amazing. I've known him over the years. You've heard his name, but you're really not sure. I know people have heard it in the background. Today, I want to bring up some of his work to the foreground. Recently, he was answering one of the questions on my Facebook page, one of the most intelligent pages on the planet, because we ask the real questions about our community. And it's pretty much a free speech zone, not a hate zone. But he brought up the fact that he had done this survey and that trauma was one of those big elements in reforming our community. Why are we not progressing in the way that we would hope for in a lot of ways? And brought in the survey. But let me go ahead and answer him. So that I caught him. He's up here. Yes, I do read your comments. So Shane, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming on such short notice.
Well, thank you for having me, Ed. Hail and greetings to everybody. Well met. Um, like Ed said, I'm Shane Nelson. Some of you have heard of me, some of you haven't.
Mm-hmm.
Many of you have heard of the organization that I serve as executive director, and that is Sacred Well Congregation. I've been executive director there for the last 2 years, and I was the director of military affairs there for the 3 years prior. Um, Professionally, I am a licensed professional counselor in the state of Oregon, which means I have a master's of counseling in clinical mental health with 2,400 supervised licensure hours before I was allowed to see clients without supervision. I also have my master's in divinity and am a board certified chaplain with 2,000 clock hours of chaplaincy experience. So all of that sets the stage for my current dissertation work on my doctorate of ministry in interreligious chaplaincy, which focuses on religious trauma and spiritual abuse as experienced by members of the pagan community.
Okay, so there's a lot there. Thank you for that. So people always talk about and where we were talking about the social media is always this ambiguity. Where does this information came from? And one of my questions in this point, and I want you to go ahead and go to that, and then we'll talk a little bit more about your work, is this idea that the community is very traumatized. It comes from traumatized resources. It comes from traumatized people, and that when they come into the community, they're trying to get past it, and that's why shadow work and all that is out there. Um, and it's
Absolutely.
an ambiguous. And so for me, this is an ambiguous feeling. This is kind of a hodgepodge that everybody says, but you can give me real answers to that. Can you talk about that?
So, when we think about the pagan community, many of us are first generation, and many of us find our way here because of some sort of religious trauma or spiritual abuse we experienced in a previous tradition. Now, I'll get into more of what that means in a little bit, but like my experience, I
Hmm.
grew up in foster care. By the time I graduated high school, I had four different families I had lived with, and each one had a different framework on how they embodied their spirituality. The last one I lived with was fairly extreme in their approach, and it really pushed me to look at other traditions. So by a junior in high school, I was starting to explore paganism. First started with Wicca, Lydie Angelus and her work, um, Anne Morrow and her green witchcraft work, and then ended up deploying with the army to Iraq in 2003,
Wow, that's quite an
where
experience.
it was, and it was more so of another type of religious trauma. I was struggling with the things I saw as an infantryman in combat, so I went to the person I was told was safe, the battalion chaplain. This battalion chaplain outranked me as an officer, so he was allowed to have me stand at the position of attention or parade rest while he communicated to me because I was a junior enlisted. He used that authority to try and evangelize for 8 months because I was not of his tradition. So all of these experiences reinforced nature's sanctuary for me, as paganism is sanctuary for me. But none of that taught me how to work with the trauma itself. It wasn't until I found my own counseling and my own chaplaincy training that I started healing from those trauma wounds that brought me to paganism in the first place. And this is what I see a lot in at least the local community, and in a lot of ways the larger community, is people have absolutely experienced these traumatic events, but there's nobody there to teach them how to heal from them. So we're bringing trauma and we're essentially trauma bonding in a community rather than having our own community that is deconstructed of our previous beliefs and practices to be our
So,
own.
so let me stop you there because there's a term you just used and called trauma bonding.
Yes.
I've only begun to see that trending a little bit in the TikTok universe of witches and some of the younger Z witches are talking about
Yeah.
trauma bonding and how and let me go ahead and reference what they were saying. And they're saying so many of the millennial witches that are trying to teach them are trauma bonded to each other and not listening to
Mhm.
us.
Yeah,
That's the exact statement I
absolutely.
heard, and I was like, what is trauma bonding? Can you can you help
So
us with that a little bit?
that framework in and of itself has two different parts.
Mm-hmm.
So the trauma bonding itself is your nervous system's reaction to relationship. So if you and I have had different traumas, but we come together and we feel comfortable enough to share, now our nervous system perceives that when I share with Ed what I experienced, this is safe.
Mm-hmm.
So we are now trauma bonded because when you share, your nervous system feels that I'm safe, but it doesn't extend out to other people. And
Okay.
this is where it comes into that second level where the elders of the community want to teach, but the millennials don't feel safe hearing from somebody in a position of authority because that's where their trauma was rooted.
It's interesting because then what I saw with this Generation Z feels like the millennial generation, which is the teachers now. People don't realize
Mhm.
they're not kids. They're the center of our community in a lot of ways. And they're having a hard time bonding with them because they don't necessarily have the same traumas.
Exactly.
Some of
Because
them
they
are
don't know
more
how to relate in
generational.
that way.
They've grown up with more magic in their entertainments. I mean, Harry Potter did break down a lot of barriers. I mean,
Yep.
good, bad, or otherwise. So did the cartoons, Captain Planet.
Hmm.
Yeah, my
Fern
favorite.
Gully,
Huh?
Fern Gully.
Yeah. So yeah, even Avatar, even for the later
Yeah.
movies, Avatar. I mean, we see this constant breakdown of metaphysical, occult, spiritual
Hmm.
identities in our entertainments, and each generation seems to have more of it in entertainment. Um, because there's one called Fern and the Wish Fairies.
Hmm.
And there's magical. The mushrooms they were sitting on are the psychedelic mushrooms, and they get wishes, and they solve problems, and they use magic. Um, and they teach them morality, a good positive morality.
Exactly.
So we're seeing that breakdown even amongst the youngest generations. They are not seeing everybody going, "Oh, that's magical." They're not seeing the grandparents that used to point at everything, "Oh, that's the Indian devil worshiping."
Yeah.
And
Well,
so,
they're starting to see the magical in the mundane.
mhm.
Whereas in previous generations, we were taught to keep them separate. We were taught to keep them secret for our own protection.
And so when we start talking about this trauma and we get into these
Yeah.
spaces, right? What did you, okay, so I'm going to let you explain. So let's go ahead. You did a study. You didn't take this at just word. This isn't just out of the
No,
books. You got real data, folks. You know me, I love real data. I tell you that all the time.
I got some substantial data.
So
And
I'm going to give you the floor
yeah,
here for a second and explain this so people can go, at least people who want to do better can at least point at something that says, this is what we do know. Because,
so before we jump into the data itself that I collected, let's jump
mhm.
into what trauma is.
Okay.
Trauma is the nervous system's reaction to an event that's outside of our window of tolerance. So when we're thinking about it, we have several parts of our nervous system. The primary is the amygdala. The amygdala works like the smoke detector for our fight, flight, or freeze response. So something sets off that smoke detector, it initiates fight, flight, or freeze in the limbic system, which then releases chemicals into our body for us to be able to fight, run, or freeze for our own survival. During all of this, our thinking mind is shut off. We are only in instinctual survival mode. And as that's happening, it goes that um, fire detector or fire alarm to the limbic system, which releases the chemicals to our body. So trauma is stored in our body, in our nervous system. And it isn't until we are able to release from the trauma or process through what's stuck in our body that we can come back to that fully functional thinking mind. So, with that in mind, we have the real or primary trauma. This might be a car accident. This might be being disowned because you identify as part of the pagan community by family members. That is the precipitating event. Now, with that precipitating event, every time a person remembers it, every time they're reminded of it, now they have a secondary trauma or an perceived trauma. More specifically, it's perceived. And the brain and the nervous system don't distinguish between the precipitating event and the perceived event. So every reminder is like experiencing it all over again. In situations like religious trauma and spiritual abuse, this impacts the way the person attaches to themselves, to others, and to their understanding of divine. Bringing feelings of guilt and shame, bringing feelings that they were betrayed or that they deserve divine punishment. All of those compound until we either have to face it or we develop post-traumatic stress disorder and we have to seek additional external professional help. So that's just kind of framing the window for this. And what my research did was it went through and it talked to 101 members in the pagan community in the US and asked them, have they experienced these types of events? Yes or no? Did they experience them from family? Did they experience them from their social network? Did they experience them from work or from spiritual settings? And of the yes or no questions that pertain to the pervasiveness, so yes, they experienced them in these settings, we found that 86% of the pagan community has experienced these types of events.
Whoa, hold on there. So we're saying 80%. Are you saying that based on your studies there, on the people who have replied, 86% of us have received some form of trauma in these
In
forms
a religious setting?
in a religious
Yes.
setting? Wow. So, and
To
again,
put that
I'm
in
I'm the
a
poster
frame of
child of that
reference,
myself. So,
the national average for traumatic events
mhm.
experienced is 75%.
Wow. So it's still pretty high.
So the exposure is high, but the exposure in the pagan community is higher by 11% than the national average.
You know, can I say there's a phenomena, and this is a phenomena of observational nature. When I talk to people who know what the difference is, and my audience does know the difference of it, these, and since a lot of you are new, I'm going to say there's statistical science, there's a lot of knowledge, and that's important for us. But I can also have, and all science starts out as subjective. All science begins
Hmm.
as subjective, magical. You may be the only one experiences some of these thoughts and imaginations. Our great thinkers did. And as you could test them out, they can eventually become observational, which means this is what I think. And this is what I feel. So I want you to guys to understand. We really want people to analyze this. The reason why I wanted you on there is this idea is that we fall into these kind of phenomena of bitching about who had the worst childhood, who had the
Hmm.
worst trauma. I have been around more
Exactly.
campfires where we're all kind of like the Saturday Night Live skit where they were like, "Oh, I'll put fish hooks in my," and these were so masochistic, in my opinion,
Yep.
events. I'm a stoic. You can, but that's all right.
Well,
It is there.
that's part of why my research only asked yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to know the details about the trauma.
Okay.
Did you perceive it? Yes or no? So that's all they could answer. I would redirect them on the form if they tried to
Mm-hmm.
tell me anything else,
Gotcha.
because the experience wasn't the important part.
And so,
The pervasiveness was.
so out of all that, what did you learn about trauma
So what I learned
within
about
this
trauma,
context?
specifically in our community, is that while 86% of individuals said yes, they experienced it, 68% said that they have ongoing symptoms related to it that impact their ability to function in community. So within our community, they feel that they have to be in some way, shape, or form solitary because they don't feel comfortable coming into the community fully in a healthy way.
Ooh, so that's getting into a really dangerous place I am in my research. As you know, I've gone back on the air as Ed the Pagan,
Yeah.
dedicated to a full year worth of researching and asking deep conversations. I know it's going to get uncomfortable, but where does the helping people with 68% still ongoing symptoms? You want to help them.
Hmm.
There's a thin line
Exactly.
between help, between medical aid, and let's be
Hmm.
perfectly honest, abusive cultism.
Exactly.
Because doesn't it, so let's start with that one. Traumatized victims can be traumatized again.
Hmm.
And there are some manipulators out there who recognize that and utilize it. We call them narcissists. We have tons of psycho. It doesn't matter why. There are individuals that are out there
Exactly.
that will use their behavior. And sometimes the nicest people if they get a chance. I mean, you know.
And sometimes it's unconscious.
Hmm.
Like one of the things that came up significantly was when a pagan community member goes to the hospital and they're approached by the chaplain. The term chaplain, whether it's the title that they use or it's on their badge, carries an implicit reminding traumatic event.
Yeah, people always ask me, why do I have full credentials? And a lot of what I do as a pagan priest, I've used the word chaplain on my
Yep,
certificates going to hospitals. I use, uh, it's not Christian. I tell people it's not Christian. It's the ambient folk religion of America.
exactly.
And so there's a difference, and we're going to get more into that later in the year, but there is a place that pagans influence.
Yeah.
And that is this idea of the American folklore religion. And there's one in China and there's one in Japan. And
Hmm.
any major language group or organization has their folk religion. And can it be very Christian? Yes. It can be is it Islam. It depends on the area. But in America, a lot of it is mythology,
Hmm.
heavily induced by Shakespeare. People they laugh when I say that, and Christianity, the Bible.
Yeah.
Um, And now we're flooded with so much information. Americans are going to are dealing with something for the first time. And I think this is about trauma too. I think this is where it is
Hmm.
that they find us and they find out that we deal with trauma. We give a lot of talk about trauma.
Yeah.
Um, Sometimes I feel, and let me ask you that pagan and pagan priests and pagan clergy and pagan priestesses, especially all those lovely high priestesses, are being used as poor people psychiatrists.
Yes.
Can you talk to that?
Absolutely. So that happens on multiple levels.
Mm-hmm.
One is as a clinical counselor, before I got my MDiv and my board certification as a chaplain,
Mm-hmm.
I was not allowed to bring up spirituality. The client had to bring it up, and then we could talk about it. So there wasn't ample space or training to have those conversations from a clinical perspective. The other part of that is like when I was on active duty, there was a large enough stigma around mental health that service members would go to the chaplain rather than go to a counselor because a chaplain didn't have to record anything and it didn't stigmatize on their records for promotions.
That makes sense.
So they were being reallocated over to these chaplains who are walking around the motor pools or out in the field with them rather than getting the professional help in the way that they needed. Now that we are looking at the civilian side of things,
Mm-hmm.
one of the community resources that Sacred Well put together was we were collecting a listing of guarded, well, it's a guarded listing of pagan specific counselors because they weren't identified elsewhere for members of our community to be able to seek out like-minded individuals who could provide that appropriate mental health care that didn't carry the implicit or the um, transferred or counter-transferred Christian underpinning that a lot of counselors unknowingly carry.
Let's be honest. So, anytime you're talking about Christian and Christian theology and Christian philosophy, in the United States, virtually all of the schools that got started were based on Christianity, the Bible, and the study of the Bible. It wasn't
Exactly.
until much later did we ever have the idea, which is already now ingrained into American intelligence, which we're loved for because it's brought us all the different places. But science came second to that a lot of times. And
It
in some
did.
states, third to sports. Uh,
And there's still schools where that is the case.
right. And that's when we hear about attacks on the universities, which are some of the longest lasting structures they outlast governments if they're allowed to. Um,
Exactly.
so we posit this sort of idea of knowledge. But the problem here I'm saying is that we have more and more people becoming pagan,
Hmm.
even if they don't mean it in the sense of we're going to get a lot of people who I'm just angry at my parents. I'm just hurt, especially amongst Z's, and I especially expect it amongst Alpha. I just
Yeah,
don't want to be them.
exactly.
So they're traumatized now. They're coming over to us, often young, very confused. Um, I've seen this over and over again. And let
Yeah.
me be honest, I saw it with the Xers. I saw it with the millennials. I'm
Yep.
seeing it going on with the Z's, but the alphas have got a bigger problem. And this is where I think the trauma is. They're aware of trauma. They're getting so much information for so many sources. The battle for their brains
Hmm.
makes it whoever is the best brands. And there's a lot we can talk about how we do it.
Well,
How
and
do
we
we
also
fix
end up
the
with
trauma?
a clinical perspective on this.
Okay.
So when we look at migration patterns, a first generation is primarily the previous location practicing the new way.
Mm-hmm.
So if they were Baptist, they're primarily a Baptist practicing paganism. That
Mm-hmm.
sounds really rough. This is a cultural framework, not a spiritual framework typically.
Right.
Second generation is now a hybrid. Third generation is the new teaching or the new culture. So if we're looking at Gen X, essentially being first generation, and then Gen Z being their kids, so second generation, and then Gen Alpha being the next, or millennials, Gen Z, Gen A. We see those three transitions.
Mm-hmm.
So now they don't have the fear in Gen A or Generation Alpha that we had in Gen X or millennials,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't have the amount of guidance, and we are passing along some epigenetic trauma as well. And epigenetic trauma is the way trauma is encoded in our DNA. So if you think about your DNA strand, you have
Mm-hmm.
caps at the end that are telomeres.
Right.
Those handle your resistance or resilience in the face of stress and trauma. Trauma from one generation is passed to the next generation biologically and reduced in its effectiveness.
So so there's a thing about epigenetics, and I've read and somebody and I kind of been playing around with the idea and like researching, but one of the things we're going to talk about is superstition, folks.
Hmm.
There's no true evidence except apocryphal, but that witches outlive populations, wizards outlive populations that they're a part of. They're old.
Yeah.
They get really old. almost to the point of being sometimes calling beyond knowing how old they are. There's this sort of trope, and sometimes it's been proved evidence they do so. And I've always wondered how much of that is that they're clearing from their own lives this sort of physical idea of trauma because it's dealing against stress. I always wondered was that mechanism. And you mentioned of telomeres. Um, but they
Potentially.
are
I mean, we're also
oftentimes,
seeing that with lifespan.
hmm
So the higher the stress, say 100 years ago,
yeah,
average lifespan was like 65. Now my clients are Vietnam era in their 90s.
hmm
Different amount of stress, but also different coping skills. So
absolutely. So the
they're
idea,
living longer.
and so yeah, that's it used to be considered magical to live longer.
It
Part of
is.
the
I mean,
culture.
that's what I tell my clients I do is magic
Hmm
in the counseling room. Because like I'll do things like EMDR and I'll get them to focus on a thing and then I'll go watch my fingers. Now how do you feel?
So since we're going to go into one more thing that I wanted to talk about, and that's you're the executive director of the Assembly of the Sacred Well.
Sacred Well Congregation. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So what would you like to know about that?
So I've been reading about it being somewhat so all I've gotten is the echoes. Remember,
Yeah.
one of the things I listen to is echoes. People will reply, "Oh yeah, we're talking about democratic systems. Are they good or bad?" Just as simple the idea: can we have democratic system? And somebody pointed out the ideas of this, and they've mentioned sacred well as one of that parts of it. I've
Okay.
heard sacred well and sacred wheel. They're two different groups. Uh,
Sacred Well is different than Sacred Wheel.
but of course they are, and I know
Yeah.
that. But you've been both mentioned as having great systems.
Yeah.
So
So
you're all both
part
East
of,
Coast. So can you talk
yeah.
about that? Maybe about your group individually and that culture that seems to be developing really good groups.
So part of Sacred Well is going into its original founding in 94.
Okay.
It was established by an Army officer and an Air Force officer who saw the need for spiritual care for service members that were pagan. So they went through the process to get 501c3 covered. So they're recognized as a formal nonprofit. This allowed them to work with the Department of Defense and the Armed Forces Chaplain Board to be able to endorse, mentor, and sponsor pagan services on military bases. Currently, I sponsor 24 or 25 bases, and I talk with the lay leaders providing those services every month. So we had this very structured military hierarchy. We've got the executive director, the vice executive director, the director of military affairs, community affairs, prison affairs, community ministry, all these different subcategories. That's this
hmm
very hierarchy based. But then when I took over, I flipped it on its head.
Okay.
I said, this hierarchy, yes, I get the final say in what we do, but that final say is guided by how it affects that private that's coming to our service for the first time. That sergeant that just got back from deployment and is looking for somebody to help him deal with combat. We are service first. So we, as a board, take no paycheck. We are all voluntary because we've all had experiences in the military that left us wanting that type of support that
Right.
wasn't otherwise there.
So, boy, my question is, this is where you do your research, folks, and I always love getting it from directly from people. Fantastic. That is great service. It was not the echoes I was hearing, so watch it. Everything that you hear you have to go back to the source. I'm really glad we got you a chance to. So that's fantastic news. I mean, I served in the military. I always tell them yeoman third. Yeah, I was a yeoman.
Okay, so you're in the Navy. I
Petty
won't hold
officer
that against
third
you.
class. Yeah, the captain's girl. Um, what? Captain's girl. What, yeah, you have to understand that was in 80. All right. That was sort of thing. So no, I was serving in the yeoman. I was serving the USS Mobile. I was the captain's yeoman for 2 years.
Okay,
During 6 months in Dallas, they decided to kick me upstairs. Uh, yeah,
that
they thought I was
works.
presentable. That was always the joke. Um,
Yeah.
and I learned a lot from that period of time. But one of the things yeah, I will tell you, I got another time for folks, but I got caught up in sort of being a spy in the sort of cults of California for the government service, naval intelligence. Yeah, there was a once upon a time we had a battle, and I think it's going to be important to think about. There's always this sort of idea of a battle for the mind,
Yeah.
and they were using religious trauma even then of the military service.
Yeah.
They were finding men who were isolated, and they
Hmm.
were pulling them into their cults in Southern California because they had plenty of money.
Exactly.
But in our community, so let me go ahead and finish this up. How can we help you? What can we do to help you with your mission?
So my research, while it has drawn from members of Sacred Well, is also drawn from members of ADF. It's drawn
Hmm.
from members of Circle Sanctuary, from Awake in the North, the Asatru community.
Hmm.
I think I even forwarded it to you and your organization when I first started.
Yep.
Um, so right now I am going through the process of finalizing my initial research
Hmm.
to be able to defend it and earn my doctorate, hopefully by May. From there, the big thing that we are working on that I think if we could come to some sort of culmination as a community would be finding a way to bring efficacy and um, equality to chaplaincy in that right now there are no pagan chaplains in the military.
No.
There are chaplains who are duly trained. So they're endorsed and sponsored by one organization, and then they've come and trained with us to get a secondary training. But there are no pagan specific chaplains. So if we
No.
could come together as a community to develop that, that has been one of my forefront works for the last 20 years.
And I've heard this I've heard this now nearly all my life. This is one of the goals. Liberty League, Circle Sanctuary. Uh, I've heard, a lot of people have worked on this. What is the difficulty that we're seeing? Because it sounds like it's just a job description. I guess people have gotten very believe that you go get a degree and then you
It
go get
is and
apply
it's
for the
not.
job. Hmm?
It is and it's not. So part of it is the question, are we pagan chaplains or are we chaplains who identify as pagan? So a chaplain who identifies as pagan is held strongly in their belief but can work with anybody.
Hmm.
A pagan chaplain can really only work with other pagans.
Okay.
Then when we get to looking at the military,
Right.
the first candidate has to be applying for active duty, has to have a bachelor's degree of no less than 120 semester hours,
Right.
and a master's of divinity from a
Hmm.
nationally accredited institution with no less than 72 semester hours. But when they're reviewing that at the board level, they don't tell you what classes that they're looking for ahead of time. when you're taking your classes.
Hmm.
So you might miss the number of credits you need for that thing. And then the first candidate can't have any medical waivers.
Okay.
So, like, my first attempt, because of my third deployment, I got my back broken when I was blown up by an IED.
Oof.
So I needed a medical waiver. I was no longer eligible at the 10-year mark. I got
Hmm.
med boarded, did the physical therapy and all the healing required to come back in without a waiver. 2 days before I was supposed to sign my oath of office as a chaplain, I had a stroke and a brain surgery that permanently disqualified me. So I've made it all the way to the point of signing that paperwork and raising my hand under that oath before I got disqualified twice.
Spirit. All I can say is spirit works in incredibly convoluted ways sometimes.
So
Yeah.
when we're looking at it,
Huh?
it's making sure the academics are there,
Yeah.
making sure the experience is there. And then once we have that first person without waiver, with all of the educational hurdles in place, ready to apply for active duty, then their supporting organization has to drop their packet, which may have all of their information or it may not. They may change it because they've changed the DODI every few years for the last 20 years,
Oh, sure.
starting with the first Buddhist chaplain
Mm-hmm.
and then the first um, Hindu chaplain and a couple others. They tweak it a little bit each time, making it a little more difficult for the first of a new faith tradition.
That's interesting. So, folks, there you go. Reach out and find out more about this. If you have an interest in this sort of thing, I know that this has been worked, and I think it's very important. And this is one of those. It's become one of those generational fights. It's one of
Yeah,
those because there's so much investment in the education, the credentialing,
exactly.
and into individuals. This is not a mass process where we can do lots of people
No.
at the same time. It's a very
As it
individualized
stands
process.
right now, I have 7 or 8 in the final steps of their MDiv, waiting to get their experience. Because let's face it, the Army made me a breach tool. If they're not
Mhm.
going to make me a door, I'm going to make a door.
There you go. And so thank you. I know now we're getting into the weeds, and I really appreciate you going there with me. Um, but Shane Nelson, thank you. And we'll have him on again. I think he's at least one of the big experts in our community that we need. And this year we're going to have this deep conversation. And
And there are
this,
many, many other conversations that we can have.
oh yeah, and I think this one's a good one. Yes, is there trauma in our community? Yes, believe people when they say they have trauma. I mean, it's there, huh?
Um, Maybe this is a to be continued conversation.
Oh, it definitely is.
The next chapter I'm writing for my dissertation is what we do with this to create safe places for healing, both within the community and outside of the community.
So with that, we're going to close. If you want to hear about that, tell us in the comments or wherever you see this, and it could be almost anywhere. The Pagan World Media Network. And thank you, Shane. And I hope we get to be one of the first people to call you Dr. Nelson. Uh,
Sounds
there we
good.
go.
Thank you. Blessings
And
all.
and there, folks, we'll be back. And our community, you see it where we need to work on. And we have people who are doing it. Support them.
Okay. And the storm is there. You're seeing it. You heard about the trauma. I want you ideas of reply. You can always come on to the Ed the Pagan Show at Facebook.com, Ed the Pagan, and talk to me in other places. I am looking for assistance and handling Discord. If you're interested in running the Ed the Pagan Show Discord and helping me learn it to a better degree, I can always use the help. Tomorrow I'll have Mary Kay. I will have Mary Hawk on the show, and we'll be talking to her. And on Thursday, I'm doing a live show called "What's the Plan." Everybody's asking me, "What's the plan, Ed? What are what we're trying to do?" And I will have that then. So with that, have a good evening, folks, and